Today we're talking to Philip Davis. Professor Davis is the Emeritus Professor of Literature and Psychology at the University of Liverpool. He is also the author of Reading for Life, a collection of poems and extracts give an account of what reading literature can do for the wide variety of individuals, especially those involved in thinking about the therapeutic interactions of literature and life in psychology, medicine, and mental health support settings. Today, we'll be talking about reading and mental health. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. When I was first at university reading literature, I met a young woman who told me that she was the daughter of two survivors of the Holocaust. I think that was why she was studying psychology, because her mother and father, though they weren't in the same concentration camp, felt that they could never marry somebody who had not shared that experience. But as a result of sharing that experience, their daughter told me, the home was often a gloomy home because of the trauma. One day, as a school kid, for example, she brought home from the school library a book about the Holocaust. And that book suddenly just disappeared because they didn't want her to know. They didn't want her to suffer from it. But of course, she did. And she told me one sentence that I've never forgotten in this context. It was when she was still a little girl, and she said to her much smaller little brother this sentence: "We have to try to be happy. We must be happy." Of course, it's a very sad sentence. And it reminds us about the relativity of these things. That's to say, I don't think happiness was a block, a substance that she could just wholly get hold of any more than she did. But the movement from sad to less sad, relatively speaking, is something like the movement related to trying to find happiness in the teeth of sadness. So there it was. That was the agenda set for me. And I remember at the time I was also reading George Eliot, the novelist, and before she became a novelist, her translation of the 17th century Dutch philosopher Spinoza. And Spinoza said of suffering and unhappiness something that was powerful to George Eliot, because she came from a puritanical tradition that perfectly rightly respected suffering. Not that it would necessarily do you good, but you respected suffering. The counterweight to that in Spinoza was that Spinoza argued that unhappiness and suffering diminished a person, was toxic, lowered their sense of life, made them a bit more dead. And the reason for this was because suffering was to do with passivity, not with action. And you couldn't get out from under what you were suffering to do things as a human being. Hence melancholia, hence depression. Let me go forward now several decades, and I'm running a research center at the University of Liverpool that's looking into the benefits of reading literature and trying to find a range of methodologies by which to test that claim. We're working with the Reader organization, which is a third sector charity which takes serious literature out into the community, often to quite difficult places, drug and rehabilitation centers, prisons, as well as libraries and schools. And the aim is not that of the traditional book club, where most of the time the texts are read in advance and then discussed. Here, the reading is live and allowed, and people then chip in. Well, one of the methods we used, and one of the experiments that we carried out, it was this: that for 10 weeks, a number of individuals, one group would involve themselves in shared reading, variety of poems and short stories, and a second group for 10 weeks would study the built environment, which is to say the building that the reader was to occupy in Liverpool in Calderstones Park and its environment and the planning thereof. And then the group that was involved in the built environment would cross over and do the reading, and the readers would involve themselves in the built environment. You see the crossover and controls. The self-evaluating questionnaire that was used here was called PANAS, which is the positive and negative affect scale. And as many of you will know, you get a range of adjectives, some of them positive, strong, interested, and some of them negative, guilty, ashamed, one of my favorites, irritable. And over a designated period of time, you measure from baseline to the end of the particular activity what the pluses are in order to gauge people's emotional, mental health. Well, at the end of each of the 10 weeks, both groups, the built environment group and the shared reading group, found an increase in so-called positive emotions, all well and good. But there was one difference, and it's a crucial one. The shared reading group included in their survey greater emphasis on so-called negative emotions like sorrow or pain. Why? Because literature deals in these things and believes that within these so-called negative emotions are positive things like love and vulnerability. And yet, although literature involved itself in those so-called negative emotions, it did not affect the overall positive feeling that came out of that shared reading experience. We concluded, therefore, two things: that literature widened the range of human emotions and was a good model for human emotions in their complexity in the world. And secondly, that the polarization between positive, happy emotions on the one side and bad, negative emotions on the other was a false polarity. So this is what literature can do. It can involve itself in the PANAS scale and yet challenge the presuppositions that the PANAS scale is based on in terms of positive or negative. That's why, though we needed a wide range of methodologies, we also wanted to present to those methodologies to the psychological sciences and so on, a different model, a more complicated model of what human life was like. Let me turn to a particular example, because that's what I do in my book. I give case histories of particular readers as empirical data. So here's a woman. She's in her 40s and is suffering from real difficulties in both her physical and mental health. Fibromyalgia, chronic rheumatoid arthritis, difficulties of mobility in relation to weight and pain, and of course, with that, depression and anxiety. And she's in a recovery college to find activities, things that she can do that might help her, even though a lot of what she's suffering from doesn't seem easily curable. So the first time she's there, there's a shared reading group set up by the reader organization, and they're reading a poem. Now, I don't know what your view of poetry is, but this poem was called A Quiet Day, and it was nothing fancy. It was simply about an egg, about boiling an egg. I'm going to read you a few lines from that poem. What a person desires in life is a properly boiled egg. This isn't as easy as it seems. There must be gas and a stove, and the gas requires pipelines, Macedon drills. There must be a pot, the product of mines and furnaces and factories, of dim early mornings and night owl shifts. Then water, the stuff of clouds and skies, and so on. All of that complexity of infrastructure had to go into the boiling of an egg. So the woman in trouble here thought two things in relation to this. One, I'm in a situation where I can't even now really do something as simple as boil an egg. All those simple things have gone for me because of my trouble. And two, if I'm going to get out of this trouble, I'm going to have to do some equivalent work with my infrastructure, not the infrastructure of how you produce the gas and the water and so on, but the psychological infrastructure that's complicated and has gone wrong and prevented me doing simple, easy things for a quiet day. I sent, because this was an interview, these comments about the poem to the poet as part of a sort of experiment in what you call triangulation. What do people think? Let's test it. The poet is a man called Baron Wormser. He's in his 80s. He lives in Maine in the States. And when he read what the woman had said, he said that he found himself weeping, which I take it is one of the happiest things that could happen with an author, because there it was. Your words cross the distance, had moved somebody deeply, involved the deep parts of them. And then I showed what Baron Wormser had written back to my reader, and she was glad. So you get this circle that we don't normally see. In shared reading, you see, to some extent, the readers sharing with the poem and each other their feelings. You don't normally see that in private reading. But here, you not only had the readers sharing it with the poem, but the author, as a third point, suddenly connecting all the things together. This is to do with the way that poems, even if you read them on your own, get you away from social isolation, have something more to offer in terms of an extra human voice that the literature provides. I'll read you the end of the poem because it was important still to the reader who kept reading it. It should be quiet, so quiet you can hear the chicken. Listen, the chicken is there, pecking at a bit of grain that came from nowhere. So this is a poem about the chicken and the egg and the infinite regress. You go back and back and back until the poem says, half humorously, God knows where something comes from out of nothing. And in a way, though poems and short stories and novels are based on experience, they also are something that come out of nothing. That's to say, you would never know if that poem hadn't been written, that a poem about an egg would be useful, important in the world. It wouldn't go missing. But here it was, something that came out of nothing for the purposes of expression, giving that woman a voice to think thoughts that were hard to think. That's important in relation to mental health. And we needed a variety of different levels and methods and dimensions of evidence, method, analysis in order to be persuasive about our hypothesis with respect to the value of reading literature and testing it. So, talking about infrastructure, one of the things that we wanted to do, quantitative interviews, films, transcripts, was also neuroscience, brain imaging. And we carried out a couple of experiments, which I'll just sketch. One of them was in relation to Shakespeare, greatest of all poets, and his use of something that linguisticians call functional shift. This is quite simple in a way. In King Lear, this old man, it is said, this old man, you have madded. And madded there is a word that was never used before, invented by Shakespeare, and is a functional shift from the adjective mad to the verb madded. Not maddened or made mad or made insane, but madded in that fast way. Similarly, in Coriolanus, this old man, it is said, godded you, not deified you, not made a god of you, but the functional shift from noun, God, into godded with hardly any change of shape. And the second experiment we did was an extension of that surprise that happens with a new word, that this time was to do with producing 4 lines of a poem with various controls put into the experiment, as in the Shakespeare, where there were less surprising things. But the most surprising thing was 3 lines of a poem, and then the 4th line would go in a quite different direction. Well, in both these experiments, so there were many things going on in the brain. And I, of course, don't know if you, as the audience, are skeptical about neuroscience or glad of it. It tends to cut both ways. But there's one part of the brain in particular that was lit up, activated by both experiments. And activation is important because you remember I was saying about Spinoza that shift from passive to active could be the most important movement against stuckness, against depression that human beings could make. One small area in the basal ganglia, in the deep middle of the brain, was particularly activated, and it's called the left caudate nucleus. So whether you believe in neuroscience or not, just to have this as a thought experiment, it's shaped like a seahorse, apparently, because I'm not a neuroscience, I rely on my colleagues to help me. And at the top, at the dorsal, this part of the brain is very good at forms of recognition when you can no longer automatically scan things. And that's one of the things that literature does. You can't go for automaticity anymore. You can't easily just process it as you might a bullet point. Some effort is required. And when it isn't literal and obvious, then the brain has to do something else and switches to centers like the left caudate nucleus that do work in terms of unexpected recognitions that are outside your normal default patterns. But at the bottom of the seahorse, the ventral, the tail, there's another mechanism, which is reward mechanism. But this is not like the worst forms of our educational system. You do something that's difficult, and then afterwards you get a reward for it. The thought experiment is this, and this is why brain imaging is so exciting to me. The two things fire at the same time. That's to say, the recognition and the reward are simultaneous. This is a little image of something happening in terms of aliveness. Two things together. Not you do something difficult, it's horrible, but you get a reward for it. But wow, suddenly you're more alive again because the language and the changes have activated something powerful. So this is about movement, not the rigid automatic ways that are your default mechanisms, not that stuckness of mind, and not above all depression. Because I am told there is strong research to suggest that the left caudate nucleus is something that is very much not activated in people suffering from depression. In depression, there's no excitement. There's no capacity for surprise. You just go round and round in that rumination that says, I'm awful, I'm awful, I'm awful, life's terrible, life's terrible. But suddenly, here in the brain, in some deep level that ascends emotionally, you come alive. It's that aliveness that I'm most interested in relation to literature, and that I would claim is the deepest meaning of what you might call happiness or well-being. And I want to end with just one more brief case history, if I may. And it's important that it is back at the human level, but also that it's individual and specific. And I'll tell you why. It's because of this, that research in psychology has indicated that depression produces overgeneralized memory. That thing about going round and round in circles. You can't remember any specific detail that doesn't fit with that terrible depressive pattern that says things aren't just awful. Well, this is a story briefly about a retired school teacher called Tom. And things have gone wrong for him over the years. He's got confused. There are layers of unhappiness, misfortune, things ill done and things done ill to him, such that he feels, as he would put it, that he's lost his first life. That sort of innocence or dynamism of feeling that he once had that's got worn down and lost. On our team on the research centre, we once had a psychiatrist who in this area himself ran a reading group and talked about recovery. In popular science, popular psychology, recovery means moving on, getting over things and getting quickly off into the future. That's not what the psychiatrist meant, and it was no use to Tom because there wasn't a lot of future. No, what recovery meant here was that you could recover from the past certain emotions, innocent, idealistic, vulnerable, that you thought you had lost forever, that you thought that had been damaged by what you had done or by what had happened to you. Only Tom felt that sometimes literature could recover those lost feelings for him and bring him back to his first life, his life again. So I'm going to end by just reading you the one specific place that he pointed me to in relation to recovery. And remember, it's specifics that are important here, because if we are fighting overgeneralized memory, then one of the things literature can do is trigger, through its specific language, specific and individual experiences that you might otherwise forget, not notice, not be able to access anymore. So here is Wordsworth, returning from a not very good time in London, back to his native Lake District, back to Grasmere. And he hadn't realized, I don't think, how unhappy he had been in London. It had been not good, not great, but he'd managed. And he goes for an evening walk back home now. And the lines go like this. While on I walked, a comfort seemed to touch a heart that had not been disconsolate. Strength came where weakness was not known to be, at least not felt. Let me explain. It wasn't that he felt disconsolate or didn't think consciously he was disconsolate in London, and that when he came back to the Grasmere, there would be some cure. It's not as simple as problem and solution. And indeed, one of the novelists in my book, Sally Vickers, says, there are no cures for life. But this was a double feeling that he found, he knew now that he had had a previous lack, which he hadn't felt at the time and only realized because now he was so glad to find it given. I'll say it again. Strength came where weakness was not known to be. Wasn't that you felt weak in London and now feel strong? You feel strong here, and then you get that added feeling of, I didn't even realize how bad it had been. That literature can do that fine-grained, specific, individual thing, makes you realize that our life is wider and deeper than our consciousness. And the more we can get in touch with that, the more alive and vital people will be, the deeper their emotions, not because this is going to be a cure and we're all going to have solutions and be mentally hygienic forever, but because we will be able more to use our experience. And that is what literature is for. Not art for art's sake, art for life's sake.
Well, thank you so much for that, Professor Philip Davis. That was absolutely incredible. A very inspiring and additionally moving talk. So yeah, thank you so much. And your passion is palpable for literature. My first question is, where did this personal love of reading and literature come from? What inspired it in the first place?
I remember certainly saying to my parents, I'm never going to be able to read when I was a kid. And I do remember the way in which when eventually you could read a primer, it was a big deal when they stopped being simple sentences. Jack saw Jill, Jill saw Jack, and that the sentence began to go over the line. Jack saw Jill and she said to him that, and then suddenly you're on a journey. And I thought, oh my goodness, that really is stretching things. So I was very aware of the difficulty sometimes involved. And what's crucial to me is that sometimes the disadvantages are really important. Those people who are very articulate and find things very easy are probably more disadvantaged in a way. It's the strugglers, whether it was me learning to read or people in a drug and rehabilitation center. It's the strugglers who have less but give more and need it more. So in my case, I think experientially, when I was in my 13, 14, I read Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, and this was about a big stumbling figure who kept making mistakes without realizing that that's what he was doing. And only through feedback did he realize, because of people's bad reactions, that things were going wrong, that he'd done wrong. He was living from within outwards, and then the feedback from outwards was making him feel awkward, ashamed, shambolic. And I suppose I was attracted to that because it was a bigger version of what, as a young adolescent, I was doing, struggling to get along. So I've always been interested in those stories of growing up. And I think one of the reasons that I turned to literature was because I was very, very close to my mum and dad. But when, as is inevitable, you begin to grow away from a bit, I needed something in place of that closeness. So literature was like a sort of replacement for an older person. A parent wouldn't look after you in the same way, but would be another voice that you could go along with.
And what fascinated me in your talk was that I didn't realize the actual tangible impact reading and literature has on neurocognition.
Yeah.
What first, is there a lot of work in this area, or what first inspired you to think, let's actually look at the neuroscience of this?
I don't think there's a lot of work in the area because most of the shifts and changes are to do with what seem to be mistakes when, through some brain imagery, there are things you can't read or you have difficulties in reading. But functional shift in Shakespeare was a sort of deliberate mistake, a deliberate sort of syntactical, grammatical error. And this meant that there was some real benefit to it out of the strangeness, because that's above all what I was interested in, finding what were the processes of surprise. We have habits, and if we're not careful, those habits will deaden us. So I was looking for something that was a deep version of surprise rather than automaticity, and some sort of change that took you into great levels of what felt to me like preconceptual excitement. They were conceptual insofar as in that excitement, thoughts were latent, nascent, ready to come. But when I was reading literature, it was visceral. So I felt almost physically that something was happening before I started doing the thinking. And education, as you know, too often starts head down. It didn't feel like that to me. So I wanted to think about physical forms of thinking, of which the brain might be a center. And one of the thoughts I had that I wanted to test, and so went to see some neuroscientists in Liverpool and in Bangor, was this thought, that if we have very rigid pathways a lot of the time, physiologically, that could be in relation to some forms of dementia, but often it's to do with just the rigidification of opinion. I just think this. We just think the same thing. Well, I thought that if you were moved by something that you were reading in front of you that had a complicated movement itself, had a complicated syntax, then the shapes in front of your eyes might have an effect on the shapes behind your eyes. And that as you followed these strange pathways of literature, not knowing in advance where you were going, it might shake up the pathways of the brain. That was a hypothesis. That was what I was trying to test in terms of the effects. And so the one thing that literature can do for science is instead of looking at the color red, try and make it, as it does for all of us, bite off more than we can chew. I wanted a genuinely complex thing that was obviously going to involve a lot of different centers, but was going to show that visceral excitement that was never exorcised by any subsequent mental, intellectual idea. Because the excitement in literature, the feeling stays there. No feeling, no good.
Brilliant. Well, I'll pass over to Avi because I know he has a plethora of questions that he'd like to. So
Okay.
I'll let him.
Chris, thank you very much.
That's quite all right. I'll be back. I'll be back after his questions with a couple more of my own.
Okay. Here he is.
There we go.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. That was absolutely fascinating. I have. I agree with. I mean, I understand everything that you're saying. I mean, anybody who is an academic has had to read their fair share of material, but I have a particular, I guess, fondness for books, just like yours from your youth. But I seem to connect more with things that are nonfiction. I'm not sure if that is something necessarily that is unique to myself or people like me, but I found Professor Dawkins's book, Selfish Gene, when I was growing up in India, and it almost opened a window to a world that I didn't know almost existed, finding it as a young boy, because culturally, India is quite religious and India is quite different. And understanding that the world is made and the world is like this was very different from reading something of Shakespeare's, which was, essential reading in class, or Lewis Carroll or something like that. So, and I have had that fondness all throughout. I mean, his books have become different, and I'm only talking about The Selfish Gene. And he is a wonderful person, but that book was almost a guide guiding me through my teenage years and the reality that was around me versus the reality that this book was creating based on evidence and research.
I love that. I love the idea that the book could be an alternative world. I think that's very important. Of course, we used to have something that was called letters rather than some division between fiction and writing that wasn't fiction. And perhaps that broader dimension, the world of letters, the world of writing, should be something that we think about. Of course, for me, it has to be something that's to do with specific human situations and forms of emotion. But one of my mentors in this is William James, the psychologist, philosopher. And what he's interested in, as I think I am, and I hope, and I know you are from what you've said, is that sudden excitement that ideas produce. And the way that suddenly there's a hot spot, as it were, in the brain, says William James, and suddenly everything recrystallizes around it. That we move through various mental fields, but suddenly something becomes the center of that field, like your reading of that book. And a new network, a new center is created. It may be temporary, it may be, as in your case, more like permanent. But what it does is offer an alternative world. And I think that's very important, particularly given how the world can be. A world, an alternative world that is nonetheless not escapism. It's like that wonderful thing in Kuhn's book about a structure of scientific revolutions, that suddenly there's some anomaly, and the anomaly becomes so powerful that, wham, everything has to be recrystallized, changed. The worldview changes. That's the biggest version of it. But I love any form of thinking that feels exciting and alive in that way.
That's fascinating. I want to extend that in two parts. So I have a two-part question, which is, one is that I find that really interesting fiction books, taking on from The Selfish Gene, like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, or even a more recent book that you can pick, almost gave me the a starting point of an organized world where the rules of physics or chemistry or things that but then it kind of opens you up to this thought experiments where you again have a guide, a framework where you can actually think thought experiments, because nobody becomes Einstein, nobody ever becomes Einstein, but nobody really knows how to even have a framework for thought experiments. And I found that for me, especially science fiction books provided me with a framework of how to actually conduct thought experiments, which are never formally taught. Epistemology is, I mean, Chris is in graduate school. I have a PhD. We are never really formally in the sciences taught the, epistemology, how to think of thought experiments, how to conduct the design.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Hypothesis. And I found that finding good authors who would take you on this journey to how to think thoughts, it was really absolutely brilliant. I wonder if you could talk about that.
That's the first part of your question, right? I'm interested in realism, the depictions of the ordinary world, where those challenges have to go on not as science fiction, but as versions of the reality that we more or less think we live in. But I grant you the imaginative power of other sorts of forms that enable you to have those thought experiences and to get, as I think you described, the experience of thinking and not just knowing the fact. So for me, in relation to science fiction, I'm particularly interested in the space fictions of Doris Lessing, her Shikasta series, which is about a planet that goes into disaster. And there is a higher planet that sends down agents to try to help this world. But one of the laws, because even in an alternative world, there still has to be certain laws of physics and so on, is that any agent who comes down from the higher world to this struggling, fallen lower one has to forget the higher world in order to be incarnate in the lower one. I love those sorts of laws and rules. There's another one, book by a man called Abbott, who was an admirer of George Eliot, the realist I'm obsessed with. And Abbott has this novel published still in the 19th century called Flatland. And what he thinks about, this book, is the various dimensions of different worlds. Some people live in line land. That's all they know. They just live along a line. But whichever dimension you live in, there's always a higher one that you can't see. But by analogy, if you know there's a lower one, you begin to suspect relatively there's something higher than the line. And so line person in Abbott's novel has to say, in order to imagine this other dimension of reality, not along, but up, though line person hardly knows what up means. So that's an imagination of different worlds and forms of imagination and belief that even when you're within your own world, you have an imagination of something beyond the limits of it. I love those experiments, but I also like non-fictional works like Oliver Sacks's. I'm particularly thinking here of A Leg to Stand On, where Oliver Sacks survives a fall down a mountain, broken leg, seems that everything's all right. Then neurologically, leg seems to be fine, but he can't move it. And suddenly this doctor has become a patient and in an area where there are no easy physical cures, and he does not know why his leg won't, as he puts it, answer his call. So again, you're thrown into an experimental world. In this case, one of hospitalization and eventual convalescence. I think it's important nonetheless that the imagination of what your husband or wife is like, even when they're annoying you, is as big an imaginative experiment as Line Man trying to imagine Square World. At least that's what I've found.
Well, that brings me on exactly to the second part of the questions, which is metaphors. Which what I find now reading English translations of Chinese authors, or even English translation of, you brought on, you talked about poetry. And now that I've had a little bit of appreciation in my life about things outside of science, I'm actually going back and reading some of the Indian poetry, but I obviously cannot read formal Indian languages, but I'm from Calcutta originally, or my parents are from Calcutta, and Rabindranath Tagore's poetry, which was translated into English to win the Nobel Prize. So these also, I am trying to understand how metaphors translate across cultures,
Yeah.
which is another way, again, the same thing that I'm trying to say, which is thought experiments, living a life that you would have never lived, could have never lived, may not ever live. But how do you actually transcend those things? Do you find the same things? Have you dealt with metaphors across cultures and in your readings? And is there a framework for understanding those?
Let me see if I can try to answer that in some bits. That one thing I didn't mention in relation to the neuroscience was that part of the brain that is activated when reading poetry is the right Fusiform Gyrus. And it's the same part of the brain that's activated when people shift from a first language to a second language, or a second language back to a first language. So what this means is that although literature is if it's English literature, still written in English, it's not a different language, but in another way it is. It's like our second language. And that's the move that has to be made. I said all the time that what's important here are movements. And metaphor is a version of movements, of a version of translation. And I'm not very much in favor of a big vocabulary of change with a capital C, as if it's so easy to change. I think it's very, very difficult. But there are minute changes that happen, which are to do with often emotions, but also that translation across the senses that metaphor and simile are involved in. That means that something that you might normally think of in visual terms, you talk about metaphorically in auditory terms, say. Can't help feeling that that expands the mind as you cross over different senses, whether they are physical senses or different meanings in that word, in sense of the word senses. So translation and transmission seems to me vital, particularly because in the case of literature, as exemplified in metaphor, then you can't just take it literally. You can't just take it in by scanning as if it was information. You have to try to decipher it and begin to let it work on your own terms, be accepted by your own terms, and change your own terms. It's that to and fro between yourself and what you are reading that it seems to me the most exciting thing. And Shakespeare is particularly powerful here because, as everyone knows, it's Shakespeare who is the great coiner of metaphors all the time. And so that sense of functional shift that I was describing, mad to madded, God to godded, is only another version of the big shifts that take place when you speak metaphorically in terms of one thing being seen rather as another. This is about newness, about seeing things newly and then feeling more alive than if you were just taking things for granted. So I think metaphor is itself a great example of the sort of blendedness, of the sort of translation that's needed when we think, and that as a result of the effort of it not just being transparent, that suddenly things come home to you more powerfully than if it was just a bit of information from a car manual. So literary, not literal.
I just wanted to come on there. Sorry to jump in at this point, Ali, but so you mentioned and you've said about the use of, like you said, the functional shifts.
Yeah.
And the actual use and the movement of literary language.
Yeah.
On the effect of mental health. Does the narrative of the story in these works of literature, does that also have an effect as well?
Yes, I think it does, because it's obviously at another level. I think that if you know too much in advance what the next word in the sentence is going to be, what the next thing the character is going to say is, what the next bit of the plot is going to be, that's not going to be any good. I'm not saying you throw in an odd word or a funny twist that's absolutely bonkers. All I'm saying is that knowing in advance is one of our worst things. And that the venture of going along with a story that you don't know where it's going to take you is very, very powerful. There's a wonderful modern novel by Joshua Ferris, American novelist, called The Unnamed. And a man there who seems perfectly happy at work and in his family suddenly gets the compulsion to walk. I mean, he just walks out of the office, out of his family, and he cannot stop walking. He doesn't know why, and there's nowhere that he thinks he's going to. So he doesn't know whether it's a physical phenomenon, he doesn't know whether it's a psychological phenomena, and we don't know, as we read this story, any more than he does, where it's going. I think that's really important.
Phil, I wonder if you have come across any of the work in natural language processing in artificial intelligence or machine learning. Because
yeah, go on.
Because there are tools, machine learning or artificial intelligence products that are being, programs that are generating text, that are generating stories. AI Dungeon, for example, is a place where people can go and play an infinite role-playing game with a GPT-2 software, which is designed by OpenAI Systems. Elon Musk is one of their funders. I wonder if you have taken a look about that. And I know that there have been discussions about AI submitting a novella for a Japanese literature competition and getting pretty high up in rankings compared to the humans' submissions. So I'm wondering if you have taken a look at any of the compositions that are coming out of the natural language processing realm.
No, I haven't. I mean, and of course, I suppose as a humanist, I'd be skeptical about them. But let's ignore that prejudice for a moment. I'm interested in anything that creates significant variations, to use a term that's like a sort of evolution, little shifts that might, at the micro level, have important consequences at the macro level. Whether an algorithm can do that, or whether a series of different participants joining in and creating a story together could do that, I don't know. It feels like, of course, the algorithm is just an external extrapolation of what writers are doing intuitively. So I'm not unhappy about some correlation between what is going on in the human mind, brain, and imagination, and some sense of what the processes are. I suspect, of course, that the processes that go on in AI or even in neuroscience are, as far as we know them at the moment, simplifications of the immense blended complexity that's going on in the human mind and the human brain. But that idea of changes, of vocabulary, of little shifts, well, it takes a lot of concentration. It takes a lot of momentum. You have to be thinking backwards and forwards at the same time. And it has to be, I would have said, relatively unprogrammed. Now, whether you can create a program for the unprogrammed and how far the limits of that are, that's the science fiction story, Avi, that you need to write.
Yeah.
You've gone completely silent on me.
No. I'm not sure if I'm capable of writing stories, but I suppose my thesis was one of those. But no, it's
it wasn't fiction.
Well, I mean, the reproducibility rate in research, biomedical research or psychology research, any of those. So, yeah, but no, I appreciate your candor about the subject, and I absolutely love the terminology that you're using of little movements, or little shifts, as you call it. We could just call them mutations. So,
and that's related to transmission and translation and so on. Everything is a war against automaticity and stuckness. If you can get any mobility at all, that's why I'm interested in emotion, apart from the excitement and human experience of it. I mean, it is about literally things moving and moving you and shifting your center.
I think that's kind of a very fundamental thing. So whether we're doing some research in lab or when we were talking about natural language processing, all we're trying to make sure is that we don't get stuck in a local maxima. We're trying to constantly shift and jostle and build in curiosity into the agent, whether the agent be a simulation or a undergraduate or a postgraduate student in lab. You're trying to build in, can you just move beyond the local maxima where you have occupied?
This is why I love interdisciplinary teams, because you get translation across different languages, different methods. You have in reading what is obviously a complicated phenomenon with many dimensions. So this conversation between many disciplines representing those different dimensions to try to build up something like a model of complexity in which the different parts or disciplines and people argue with or find resonance across the apparently different fields, I think that is really exciting. So even the conversations with colleagues in psychology, medics, people in neuroscience are exciting to me, because it gives me a fresh look and a sense of that this, as you say, could go further. I don't want to be the man who lives just on line land. I would like to get to another dimension. But any small shift, could be, well, Bergson says that may be how things work in evolution, that you just have to find a small niche to survive and flourish in, and that might be what you could build from.
Now, we live in the age of information where we're all constantly being bombarded with bite-sized news clips, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. How pertinent is literature in today's society when mental health is such an issue?
Slow reading, I suppose. I mean, the haste of fast reading, of bullet points, of, as you say, the bombardment of information, I think has real risks at the level of attention, memory, even just absorption and immanence, so that you get into something and there is something to get into, and that what you're getting into is not just a book, but the inside of yourself. So I want something other than information. I want something that's slower. I want sometimes a syntax that is, as I said, following a journey and not just the info summarized. There's something ugly about just learning bits of stuff, as if you don't get the inside of a thought, you don't get the feel of a thought, the excitement or experience of a thought. I'm not really interested in originality. I'm interested in, if there is a thought, what was it like to think it for the first time? Imagine that. That would make that thought stick deeper for me. That's the real originality, not the newness and novelty all the time, but to get back to the origins as if it was being thought for the first time. So what I'm interested in is that shift from when people say, in terms of opinionatedness, well, I just think that. And you know that whatever's going to follow is going to be just awful, because it's very much, you're just going to stick to it. And when people use different instruments of investigation, which we found in the reading groups across a wide variety of ages and educational backgrounds, when suddenly something is not just transparent information, they say, not, I just think that, they say, it's as if, it's almost as though. And people instinctively go for that sort of vocabulary, quite close to metaphor, as if that's a launch pad, not to uncertainty, but to investigation. So I think it is better to know one thing with deep feeling and a sense of what's at stake than to know 25,000 things superficially. I don't think we're just going to get bombarded. And the one thing William James is always stressing is don't be bombarded. We can't afford to be bombarded. The brain and the human mind are developed in order to choose and select, and we should be careful about what we choose and select, so that I don't want cheap and horrible fizzy beer. I would like it properly brewed. I don't want, ideally, quick food, fast food. I would like something better. So if I'm going to be fussy about my beer and my food, why wouldn't I be fussy about reading or the slow stuff instead of just the gobble? Because we need to be able, there are some thoughts that we have, I mean, often to do with our difficulties, that we need to think. And to have the apparatus to slowly think of things is really important. I'm not claiming here to have clues, answers, or to be a person of a great intellect or great mental health. I just am having some sense of what I think is the way to go.
Yeah, I think very, very pertinent points in today's climate. What is happiness to you?
Well, I'm better at knowing what unhappiness is, and as I say, struggling to avoid it. I think that, of course, it's not an add-on. It has to be something that goes on within that increased sense of life. I want to feel more alive, even if that's in the middle of something that's difficult, painful, sorrowful. I don't just want some impossible sort of happiness that I'm going to suffer from the lack of, not realizing it's impossible. That would be foolish. But somebody once said to me, look, you know, there are these two forms of happiness. There's eudaimonia, the sense of a life worthwhile, and then there's the more instant happiness that's sometimes called Epicureanism. So which said this punter, which would you prefer, the life that's wholly worth living, or these short bangs of happiness? And of course, like anybody else, I want both, don't you?
I completely agree.
But we're lucky with what we get, and I think that what's most important is some sense of meaning. I have known how to fight a bit against depression, and I do want to hold on to some meaning during the times that are not so happy, because I do think you build up stores of stuff that you can fall back upon and believe in during the hard times. And literature, I'm grateful to literature because it's given me some of those stores. And those stores aren't just to do with the great poets, there's also to do with what they have awakened or made me remember in me, even in a small way.
So one of the questions that we ask all of our guests is, if you had infinite funds to do the research that you would choose, what would you do?
Well, one very practical bit of research that I haven't had the funding to do would be very simple. We'd set up some reading groups in which people are reading literature, and then another group is reading stuff that is not literature. It might be not just nonfiction, it might be newspapers, but we need those crossover designs to see what, if we can, the added benefit of reading literature would be. That would be one simple thing I'd like some more funding for. The neuroscience is expensive, but I'm very interested in the relation of brain imaging to eye tracking. Eye tracking, when you're reading literature, is not straightforward. Eyes keep moving backwards and forwards, fixating as if it's not just linear. It's a complicated sort of movement. And I'd like to be able to show more of that in relation, if possible, to neuroimaging. So anything that better realized the complexity of these things, but the complexity not for the sake of difficulty, but for the sake of life, for the sake of feeling, for the sake of vitality. I want to be able to find, like the spike of a graph, those moments, as I think we have to some extent in the neuroimaging, when things come alive, when the brain becomes excited, and when attention for microseconds afterwards is lifted as a result of something powerful happening. If I could do more research into showing how we were more alive as a result of what literature could do, that wouldn't be mainly about what literature could do. It would be about the untapped potential that we can unlock by means of reading literature. And there may well be very many other means, but I want to be more. And I want people to know how to be what William James calls the more. Not necessarily better or cured or happier, but at least the more.
Well, I think that's a fascinating answer to quite a difficult question sometimes. And thank you.
Yeah, give us the money now. And I'll come up with a design.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Professor. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to the money that's going to come, that's going to enable me to create this great think tank. And I hope you'll come along to it and join in, because in a way, that's what this festival is, isn't it? A great think tank.
Exactly, precisely.
Thank you for having me.